what is the role of NASA and government in the future of American space? But then there's a completely different model in China.
Mm.
Well, I think it's different. Tell me if I'm wrong, but what about countries where it's still going to be primarily government? What does that look like, and how do the two different approaches
Mm.
coexist?
That's a great question. I guess let me start with the American part. The thing that I've always thought was really insightful in terms of as NASA thinks about the evolution of its role, uh, is that NASA has has always wanted to focus on the stuff that the private sector can't do. They haven't talked about that very much because we haven't had much of a private sector active in space on its own. But NASA loves, in some ways, the idea of turning more and more of low Earth orbit and other things over to the private sector so it can go out into deep space. It can do that stuff that the private sector, at least at the moment, can't find a way to make money on. And so just reinforcing that idea that it's not that NASA is going away or becoming less important, it's that they're able to devote their limited funds to what they do best, and the same for the private sector, I feel like is the right way to think at the first step. And that's partly this decentralization thing. But coming back to the framework, there are still roles that the public sector can play in, as an economist would say, sort of internalizing various externalities that these private sector companies can't quite get. And so part of it, some of those are positive, right? So uh, there's a bit of a happy cycle, a virtuous cycle in terms of the development of a sector like this, and NASA can get that ball rolling with some early funding for startups and plugging some gaps where they exist and just trying to create a whole greater than the sum of the parts. And then, of course, I think everyone listening to this is aware of some of the negative externalities from space debris and other things where we need public sector players to step in and kind of, or we might need them to step in if the private sector can't internalize them themselves, and sort of raise the red flag and put incentives in place. So I think that, but my sense is that that relationship, though of course there's going to be fits and starts, has been evolving pretty healthily in the U.S. When you ask about other countries, I mean, I don't know, Brendan, you probably want to weigh on in on this too. I think there's some countries that are just at an earlier stage, and so they don't have a private space sector that can really live on its own very well. It might try to slot into various aspects of the supply chain, et cetera, that's coming largely out of the US and Europe, and that's great. But if they're smaller countries, especially, they will probably be running most of their space activities through the government, piggybacking off of these larger space programs. And then, of course, there's China, which has a very different way of thinking about a lot of things, including how to think about the space sector. And look, China's had an amazingly successful space program. I guess I tend to believe that having the private sector not be quite as hand in glove with the state will actually end up being a real advantage for the US relative to the more centrally controlled system that China is working with.